Hans Wilsdorf was born in Kulmbach, Germany on March 22, 1881, by parents Anna and Johann Daniel Wilsdorf. He was the second son of 3 children. His family ran a fairly successful business that was passed down from his grandfather, selling iron goods, classifying them in the middle-range class. Unfortunately, his mother got ill during the next few years and died in 1892. To make it worse, a year later his dad would pass away too, leaving Hans an orphan at the age of 12. Now under the custody of his mother's brothers, his uncle immediately decided to sell his family's business and used some of the money for their education, putting all 3 of them in a nice, prestigious boarding school called Ernestinum Coburg in Bavaria, Germany. Hans hated this decision early on and became depressed. While living in the new town, Hans was seen as an outsider and was often teased by other boys because of his religion. To get through his difficult childhood, he decided to put his focus on school. As he got older, he understood that even though he didn't like the decision of his uncles, it became an important factor for his success. Our uncles were not indifferent to our fate. Nevertheless, the way in which they made me become self-reliant very early in life made me acquire the habit of looking after my possessions. And looking back, I believe that it is to this that much of my success is due. Hans enjoyed reading books and became quite the bright student in school. The subjects he most notably excelled in were mathematics and languages, where he learned French and English. He was always curious about travel and knew that languages would be very useful, which would eventually play a big role in his career. During school, he became friends with a Swiss boy who would tell him stories of his birthplace in Le Chaux-de-Fonds, a city located in Switzerland that was well known for its long history in the watchmaking industry, and Hans became very intrigued about the place. One day, Hans was sitting outside with his much older brother-in-law, Alfred James Davis, and talked about life and plans for their future. Hans told him he felt he was confident enough to open his own business of watches, but he just needed some capital. Alfred did have the money and knew how passionate Hans was about watches. Despite being very young, he took a chance on the German and told him he was going to help him on his business venture and was ready to invest his money. They shook hands together, and in 1905 they founded the Wilsdorf and Davis Limited, which would eventually become Rolex a few years later. They partnered up with a Swiss watch company called Hermann Egler, which was based in Switzerland, and started importing movements from the Swiss country to England, placing them in watch cases. They also opened an office in Bienne, Switzerland, to favor his partnership there. Soon after, they were specializing in the distribution of timepieces at affordable rates. Even though Hans was a lover of watches, there was one major thing he found unfavorable about the watch industry: pocket watches. At the time, wristwatches were mostly worn by women as jewelry and were looked down upon by some, the reason being for not being well precise on the time. These watches were much smaller than pocket watches and consisted of smaller movements, which would regularly make the clock either go faster or slower due to small details in the movements. This was the main reason why pocket watches were more popular at the time and was considered masculine for its bulky size, but for Hans, he mostly found it inconvenient to use. It was a little hassle for him every time he had to reach his hand in the pocket in order to see the time, especially when his hands were busy. Until then, it was thought to be almost impossible to create the perfect wristwatch that could consistently show the exact time and be in everyday use. My personal opinion is that pocket watches will almost completely disappear and that wristwatches will replace them definitively. Hans Wilsdorf, 1914. Hans predicted that sooner or later, wristwatches were going to be the new norm for everybody and was fully committed to finding a way to create the perfect wristwatch for it. He spent the next several years traveling to many countries all around Europe and met countless watchmakers to discuss about the small details of watches. During those years, he started to release his own wristwatches, beginning the same year he founded his company. One watch after another, he was crafting down on creating a better, high-quality and reliable wristwatch for men and women, applying what he learned from other watchmakers from his journey. Soon after, his company began to get some traction, and by 1908, it was one of the top firms in the watchmaking industry in England. By now, Hans wanted to change the name of his company to something high-class, catchy, and easy to say no matter the language. It also needed to be short so the name could fit easily in the dial of the watch. He spent a big deal of time combining 5 letters from the alphabet to come up with something, until finally, Rolex was born. He immediately knew it was the perfect one, and a few days later, he registered the Rolex name as a trademark for Wilsdorf and Davis Limited in 1908. During the next few years, Rolex was becoming known for its high-quality wristwatches, and many rich people were already starting to use it. But it didn't take long after, when the First World War broke out, and many businesses, including watch firms, were struggling to stay in business, and even had to shut down in some cases. But not Rolex. This tragic event only made Hans' company more famous because of its already reliable wristwatches. Many soldiers were given Rolex watches instead of pocket watches because it was much easier and safer to use. It also helped them to better coordinate their attacks because of its precision on time. By then, the company had grown to such extent that they were employing 60 people in 1914 and had big open office spaces in London. To further their credibility, Rolex had already won the first ever wristwatch chronometer rating from Switzerland, followed by a Class A certificate of precision from London's Kew Observatory. This made the brand more trustworthy for people to buy. But not everything was sunshine and rainbows for Hans. In 1914, the British applied 33% tax for all companies registered in Great Britain that were exporting goods across international borders. It became a big concern for Hans, so he moved his company's headquarters from London to Bienne, Switzerland, in order to avoid these taxes. Another reason for his move was because of the World War. People from Britain began to dislike the Germans. Since the name Hans Wilsdorf was clearly German, and even though he registered Rolex before, he was still using the Wilsdorf and Davis name in England, which was getting looked down upon. This also led him to completely switch his company name from Wilsdorf and Davis Limited to the Rolex Watch Corporation Limited in 1915. 10 years later, Hans would also register Rolex's famous trademark logo of the 5-star crown, which became implemented from then on the dial of their watches. In 1919, the Rolex Watch Corporation moved its main office from Bienne to Geneva, where it still stands today.